This is a weekly podcast that is heard on radio 96.3 FM and on cablecast via Comcast. The program can be reviewed on YouTube. Happy New Year. And speaking about calendar years, this marks the end of the program's first calendar year. We've had about 30 guests since we started last spring. Sometimes we talk about the history of the river. Sometimes we talk about the health of the river. I am the outreach historian at the Custom House Maritime Museum. So we're very interested in history and the health of the river. The Merrimack is getting dirtier, not cleaner, as I think many of us know. In 2006, it was named one of the 10 most vulnerable, dirty rivers in the country. So this is an important element that we talk about, and sometimes public officials are here, and sometimes environmentalists, but not always. Sometimes I speak about a subject. I am a historian, and I have written several books on the topic. I wrote Nautical Newburyport, A History of Captains, Clipper Ships, and the Coast Guard. That came out 2 years ago. And a book on the New England Coast Guard is coming out in March. That is called New England Coast Guard Stories, Remarkable Mariners. So I have, some facts at my fingertips. I've done a lot of work about local history. So frequently I talk about the history of the Merrimack as we know it here in Newburyport. Now, Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. And today, because we're talking about years and Happy New Year, I'm going to go over some years that occurred in the Coast Guard history. So we'll perhaps start with 1790 and move up. This information comes from Coast Guard historians, and it'll be in my new book, New England Coast Guard Stories. But I'm going to start with some years, and I don't know how far we're going to get. I'm going to make comments as we go along. But I think one element of the outreach historian is a situation where I can bring some elements of local history to the viewer, to the listener, and to YouTube. And I enjoy doing that. I think it's good to get history out of the museum and into the public sphere. So I'm going to talk for a while about some of the years that were famous, particularly in the Coast Guard history. Now, Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. We do talk about that. On August 4th, 1790, Congress authorizes Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton to build 10 cutters to protect the nation's new revenue. The nation was young. It did not have much money, and Hamilton convinced President George Washington to build some cutters so that these armed vessels could stop smuggling, which was bringing a lot of goods into the country without them being paid for, and also to go on ships to check the manifests and to make sure that they were paying appropriate amount of duties. And so in 1790, the first cutters were built. And the service was known alternatively as the Revenue Service or the Revenue Marine Service, and eventually is called the Revenue Marine Service way back up in 1863. Now, it was all the way till 1915 before the U.S. Coast Guard, before that name was formally used. But so in 1790, we had the first revenue cutters built. Several of them were built in Newburyport, including the cutter Massachusetts. She is thought to be the first ship constructed by the service, and is largely for this reason Newburyport is known as the birthplace of the Coast Guard. That claim was confirmed in writing by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965. A Marine cutter had 4 officers, 4 enlisted men, and 2 cabin boys. It was armed with 6 small guns, and it was about 60 feet long. So that was the nature of some of the vessels. In 1791, the cutter Massachusetts was launched and thus what became the Coast Guard had its first vessel, and that is why Newburyport is the birthplace. And a lot of people still don't know that. I see people at events or holiday parties, and I mention it, or they ask me, "Is this really the birthplace of the Coast Guard?" So yes, Newburyport is. In February of 1799, the service becomes responsible for enforcing quarantine seas at law. Now, that's interesting because we don't have so much plague and pestilence as they used to. But in the old days, a vessel came in and there was smallpox or there was diphtheria or some of those diseases. Quarantines were very important. The people in the town did not want sick seamen coming in. So the Revenue Cutter Service was charged with enforcing this unpopular law, certainly unpopular with captains. And the act was eventually repealed. But for many years, the Coast Guard, did enforce the quarantines. And for a while, that was pretty unpopular. 1808, that's our next date. There was a law. This is a major law in American history. January 1st, 1808, the importation of slaves became illegal. Now, of course, slavery continued well beyond 1808 until 1863 and 1865 when the Emancipation Proclamation Act became law. But in 1808, you could not import slaves to this country. The Revenue Cutter Service, a.k.a. the Coast Guard, was charged with enforcing this law, and it gave them more to do, more responsibility. However, many New England shipyards still built vessels for slaving operations owned by companies in other countries. Now, that's one of the questions of Newburyport history that people frequently ask. Were the captains of the day and the builders of the day involved in slavery? Well, they were involved in slavery. They built ships that they knew would be slaving ships, some for England, France, some, parts of Africa who were slavers themselves. But supposedly, there weren't any captains or ship owners that actually traded in slaves themselves. In other words, I don't think there were many records where slaves were brought to Newburyport, but they did build ships for the slaving trade. In 1822, that's our next date, there was the passage of the Timber Act. This was a federal act where Congress created a lumber supply for the U.S. Navy and authorized the president to use whatever means to prevent the cutting of live oak on public lands. This task required shallow draft revenue cutters, like we were just talking about, and they were used extensively. This marks the start of the service's environmental mission. Now, if you think about the Coast Guard today, and you think about an oil spill, say, that happens, say, in the Merrimack River or, out in Boston Harbor or wherever, the Coast Guard is generally one of the first organizations on the spot. They have the ability to contain an oil spill. They have an ability to assess how serious it is. But this goes back all the way to 1822, not to oil, of course, but to oak and other timber. Early in the 19th century, oak and other woods were becoming very valuable. A lot of wood had been cut by 1822. And one of the reasons that Newburyport did become such a shipbuilding and commercial center was because we had plenty of wood for lumber. Our Merrimack River goes 117 miles to the west and to the north. Other places like Salem and Ipswich, who also built ships, they did not have that much lumber. So Newburyport always had a lot of lumber coming downstream. And by 1822, though, I think federal authorities were getting concerned about the stock, and they told, I'm going to use the word Coast Guard, it's Revenue Cutter Service, but I'll use Coast Guard, not to be confusing. So they told the Coast Guard, you have to be careful, you have to be watching that not too much timber is taken down. In 1831, the Coast Guard got another mandate. The Treasury Secretary at that time directed the revenue cutter Gallatin to cruise the coast in search of people in distress. Now, we all know that many vessels sank off of Plum Island, off of Boston, off of Portland. Shipgoing was a very dangerous task. But in 1831, this is the first time a government agency is asked specifically to search for those who might be in danger. And at the Maritime Museum here in Water Street in Newburyport, there's a whole list of where and when ships went down off of Plum Island. But by 1831, the Coast Guard had been mandated to look for people in distress. If they saw a boat going down, then they were responsible for going out. Now, for many years, there was a phrase, you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. Now, this sounds a little defeatist to me, but for many years, the feeling was if there was a ship in distress and a lifeboat or a gang of a team of rescuers could get out there, then they had to try. Now, this has changed in recent years because there's risk assessment algorithms. There's a lot of thought that goes into it. And why lose 5 people going out to save a wreck when if you didn't send them out, there'd be a wreck anyway, and you'd save 5 people. Now, this happened off of the North Shore itself, not with the Coast Guard, but back during the blizzard of 1978, there was a group of 5 fellows in Gloucester who were on a pilot boat, and that is a very, very powerful vessel. It's maybe 60 feet long, and there was an SOS from a tanker less than a mile off of the Gloucester coast. The Coast Guard started to go out to try to save them, but officers called it back. If you were around for the 78 blizzard, it was snowing so hard you couldn't see. If you were in a car, you couldn't see 15 feet ahead of you, and this is true. It's not an exaggeration. If you were in a boat on the ocean with, no street lights, no lights coming the other way from vessels, you could see nothing. So the Coast Guard started to go out after this vessel, but they came back. This vessel that did go out to try to help is known as the Can-Do out of Gloucester. It did go out, and it did not come back. All 5 of the sailors on board were lost. Their bodies were found several days later. But this was an example, and someone pointed out later, the vessel under duress was like 600 or 700 feet long. What's a 60-footer going to do to help them? It couldn't lead them anywhere in the blizzard. Perhaps it could have fished people out of the ocean, but I don't think anyone abandoned ship. So it's curious that was the name of the vessel, the Can-Do. They tried to do it. They tried to save people, but all were lost. So this is a situation in 1831 where the Coast Guard started to get involved in saving people. Now, in 1845, Congress authorized the first Revenue Cutter Service Engineering Corps in response to needs generated by steam engine technology. Metal buoys were also put into service because they last longer. The riveted iron barrels replaced the older wooden stave construction, and we all know that iron is going to last longer than wood. And one of the curious things about the steam era, which came and went, was how many explosions there were. Now, Mark Twain wrote a book called Life Along the Mississippi. And he wrote about, even though he's known for Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, this was largely about the era of steamships. And particularly, because he had been a pilot and an apprentice on a steamship on the Mississippi, he knew a lot about it. And he would document the numerous explosions that took place. This was before any regulation. And people would get a lot of travelers on, or, it's a very dangerous technology because you're working with fire, you're working with steam. And the number of explosions was remarkable. as Mark Twain himself pointed out in Life Along the Mississippi. But here we have, in 1845, the Coast Guard getting involved in steam engine technology and creating regulation to make them safer. So that's good. That's very interesting to me. Now, just in case you're tuning in, this is Life Along the Merrimack you're listening to. I am Dyke Hendrickson. I am the outreach historian for the Maritime Museum here in town. And one of the things I do is try to bring local history from out of the museum and into the public. So today we're talking about different important years in the history of the Coast Guard. And again, I say it, the Coast Guard's, the birthplace of the Coast Guard is in Newburyport. And so I repeat that many times, but I must tell you that is not a known fact in town. 1857, we've moved up. Construction begins on the Harriet Lane, a vessel. The cutter is equipped with a steam engine and side paddle wheels and was considered the height of technology. Now, Harriet Lane, the person, was the niece of President James Buchanan. He served from 1856 to 1860. He was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I only know that because I have been to his museum, Wheatland, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I went to college there at a place called Franklin and Marshall College. What I remember about James Buchanan is he's considered the worst president ever. I wouldn't go into modern times, but it was 1856. He was not forceful about what to do about a possible civil war. A lot of his sympathy actually was for the South. Most of his friends were senators from the South. And it sounds strange now, but one of his concerns was he feared that if the federal government was too harsh, southern states would secede. Of course, they did secede, but in 1856, no one knew that. And another person who lost political currency during this time was our own Caleb Cushing, for this very reason. Cushing grew up here in Newburyport. He was congressman. He was he was attorney general. And he was very much a possibility for presidential timber in 1856 and 1860. But he had a rather conciliatory approach towards the South. Again, his concern was, if we're too tough, they may secede and there'll be a civil war. So it's hard to say. I hate to think of James Buchanan of Lancaster being, the worst president ever. I have been, as I say, to his museum, Wheatland, and it is unprepossessing, I've got to say. But nevertheless, he lived in one of the most turbulent areas that there was, eras. 1840, say, to 1860, he was at his peak. 1856 to 1860, he was president. James Buchanan. So we're up to 1871. In response to public demand, Congress appropriates $200,000 for a life-saving service under the Treasury Department. It authorizes the employment of paid surfmen and the constructions of new stations where needed. The department assigned certain men to review the state of life-saving in the United States. His report found the system in deplorable disrepair and in a state of near-complete unreadiness. So a fellow from Maine, Sumner Kimball, is appointed to lead the Revenue Marine Bureau. So here we are in 1871. We've seen that the Coast Guard took on new responsibilities. Now we're finding Congress was starting to get concerned about the number of ships that were going down, of people lost, of cargo lost. And so they were given $200,000 to create a life-saving service. Now, there were numerous lighthouses. Plum Island, of course, had one, Salem, Portsmouth, Portland. And much of the life-saving came out of those lighthouses. But you can imagine there's only a few people at a lighthouse at the most. So these were services that were going to be on shore. And Plum Island was one of the first to have their own crews, and they were ready to move forward if there was a ship going down. There's a wonderful photo at the Maritime Museum here in Newburyport, which shows about from 1892. It shows a boat of about 8 or 10 men going out. It's high surf, having trouble getting out there, but there was a ship foundering off of Plum Island. And it's rather dramatic, in part because photography had only been created around 1840. Several of the early experimenters in photography were from Newburyport, actually. By 1860, photography had gained a great deal, and many of you may have seen photos from Matthew Brady and others, which depicted the Civil War. So this was the first time that people back in the community or who were not in the war could see what war looked like. Not the running and shooting, of course. There were no films at that time, but they could see the soldiers in the field around their tents. They could see many dead bodies. His photography from Gettysburg is well known. But I think about this in 1892. There's a wonderful photo of rescuemen on Plum Island going out for a ship. Now here we start talking about instruction and what will lead to the Coast Guard Academy. In 1876, the Revenue Cutter School of Instruction is founded. Now that was the precursor to the Coast Guard Academy. So that's 1876. In 1877, the first class of revenue cutter candidates began on the school ship Dobbin, with 9 cadets, 3 officers, 1 surgeon, 6 warrant officers, and 17 crewmen. Now this is interesting. That's way back in 1877. But today, there's still a vessel under sail which takes out cadets. It is the Eagle. It's 295 feet long. It is kept down at the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. But isn't that curious that all this time later, there's still a training vessel under sail that the cadets take and learn some skills. Now, one of the curious things about the Eagle is it was built by the Germans during the 30s. It was going to be a war vessel. But the Americans took it over, and in 1946, it was taken over by the U.S. service, repainted, refitted, and set up as a training vessel. So I always find that interesting. The Eagle, this wonderful all-American tall ship, which, goes from Florida to Canada each year and is used for the cadets, that was actually German-built prior to the war, but we ended up with it. In 1881, that's where we are now, the Lime Rock Lighthouse in Rhode Island was created, and Keeper Ida Lewis became the first woman to be awarded a gold life-saving medal. Now, most of history of the Coast Guard, or anything actually, is about men. But Ida Lewis from Rhode Island lived with her folks in one of the lighthouses off of Newport, and was involved in many life-saving events. And I give a presentation to groups and schools, and one of my, not a photo, but a rendering is of her going out with 3 or 4 men. They're in a 18 to 20-foot dory. It's high seas, and she's going out to rescue some people who are jumping overboard off of Rhode Island. So she was a major person, and whenever I can fit some women into history, I do. Obviously, women had an enormous role in the life of every community, but they did not, have a life on the water, really, unless it was the wife of a captain. They did not do much in terms of fishing, and, of course, they bore the brunt of many a sad story, because, as I think we know, many fishermen were lost, never came back. A huge amount of ships from Newburyport and the North Shore were just lost without a word ever. They had to go around the tip of South America frequently if they're going to the west, and it's unpredictable there. It's stormy. There can be icebergs, and so many vessels were lost, and that's how women, that was their role in a way. Newburyport had many orphans, and there's a wonderful statue in Gloucester, which could speak for Newburyport as well, about a mother with several children, at her skirts, looking out to sea. They're looking for their father. They're wondering if the next ship may have picked him up. They're wondering if he somehow got on board. But an enormous amount of men lost their lives at this point. So it looks like we'll maybe get through half our text today. We'll get to 1900. But this is, I think it's instructive because I never knew any of this stuff, and I'm a journalist. I covered the waterfront for the Daily News here in Newburyport for 6 or 8 years, and I didn't know a lot of this stuff, so that's why I'm moving forward. 1888, a life-saving keeper named Joshua James down in near the South Shore, near Hull, and his crew rescued 13 people from a vessel that was going down, and he also got a life-saving award. So the federal government in the late 19th century started giving awards. Now, we're almost out of time. I am Dyke Hendrickson, the outreach historian for the Maritime Museum here in Newburyport, and I talk each week at 2 o'clock at this time, and we talk about the history and health of the Merrimack River. We will have guests in the future, but this is one of my efforts to just talk about the history of the Coast Guard, because it reflects on so much that did happen to and about Newburyport. So 1890 is the last entry, for today's 30-minute presentation. But this is interesting as well. 1890, the cutter Wolcott confiscates an undeclared amount of opium on board a steamer. Now, this is the first recorded narcotic seizure, though, and I think we know now that the Coast Guard and, many services have gotten involved in trying to stop drugs coming into our country. Several cutters out of Boston, they go off of South America, they'll go through the Panama Canal, and they'll go to the southern coast of California and come back with many pounds of cocaine. I don't think they're getting as much marijuana, you might say, in part because it's legal here, and I think the pressure will die down. But narcotics, I think we know that, is still a major concern. So in 1890, this was one of the first times that there was a narcotic seizure. Also, and this I find interesting, the Coast Guard helped with bringing reindeer from Siberia to Alaska. Now, this sounds a little unusual, but people were concerned that the native population in Alaska frequently was without food. And so the Coast Guard helped with bringing reindeer from Siberia to Alaska, which isn't that far. And so reindeer and later elk were introduced to Alaska. And the Coast Guard had a big role in that. So that's yet another thing I didn't know about this. So we're just about out of time. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. This is 96.3 on the radio, FM, and Comcast TV runs this show. Also, it's on YouTube, and what we do is bring history to the people. We talk to environmentalists. We talk to political figures. And so we'll be back next week. I may have a guest, but on the other hand, I also have my homework done for next week. We came to 1890 and the history of the Coast Guard. Next, we'll start with 1901, and that includes some of the early days of the Coast Guard Academy, some of the early days of the Rescue Service. So there's a lot to talk about. And I hope you folks had a good holiday weekend. We're pleased that we had a good 2019 here at Life Along the Merrimack. We started in the spring. We're still going, and I hope you find our programs interesting, and informative. So this is Dyke Hendrickson, the host of this show. We'll be back again next week, and I thank you for being part of it. Goodbye.